here we are, our very first Recap TV of Arctic Frontiers 2024, actions and reactions, global actions and Arctic reactions. And as promised, for those who have attended the very first big picture, we will recap the the best arguments and the best discussion points in that Recap TV, and you can revisit and rewatch us talking about the last 90 minutes as often as you want. I'm joined here by three gentlemen from Arctic states and non-Arctic states, like myself. I want to start to my left, Stephane Dion, Special Envoy of the Canadian government to Europe and former Canadian ambassador to Germany. To my right, Nanni, who is a researcher at the University of Oslo, a specialist in glacier studies and emerging leader, Arctic Frontiers emerging leader, and very well known to the Arctic community, Mike Sfraga, chair of the US Arctic Research Commission. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining here in the 7th floor of this very beautiful hotel here in Tromsø, and making it actually to Tromsø, as it was quite difficult for some participants. Again, the idea of the Recap TV is really to listen to 90 minutes of discussion of what's happened on stage, and then discuss it in a light manner and see if we can find some common ground or some issues where we disagree. I want to start with a light question, something that I think was an interesting conclusion for that very first session was the future of the Arctic from a media perspective, from a communication perspective, and the question of what is the right headline for the Arctic these days. You know, we hear a lot about climate change, we hear a lot about geopolitics, security, the Arctic, the more global Arctic, but also more about local resilience. And I want to start with you, Stephane, the right headline for the Arctic from a Canadian perspective who lives in Europe.
Well, Andreas, if this is your light question, what will be your heavy questions? I would say, will the world keep its barometer? That would be my headline.
All right. Mike?
Will the world understand that the Arctic is connected in every way to the global commons, to global humanity? Will people understand that the Arctic isn't this far distant away place that you just read about or see photos of? That in fact we are interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent.
Will the world understand? Ugo, what do you think?
Will the world accept to face the consequences of our way of life, which are very well visible in the Arctic?
Okay. So that right headline, I think that brings me straight to you as an emerging leader. You have been traveling the Arctic. I have heard you encountered some issues, not taking the cruise ship eventually, but the bus, because of Arctic weather. If you look back at Arctic Frontiers Emerging Leaders Week, what would be the 2-3 messages you want to sell via YouTube now that you guys have discussed and you think is relevant to be more discussed?
I think a relevant point we've been discussing between all of us, so 30 young leaders from all over the Arctic, it's the link between the knowledge and the decision, especially in the big picture we have just seen. We had a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway that were really stating that the decision should be based on the best available knowledge. However, one question we have been discussing a lot with our group of emerging leaders is that we are seeing that Norway, among others, is still taking decisions such as deep sea mining exploration and granting new oil and gas licenses that goes against the recommendation of the scientific community and of indigenous people interest, because it will promote further climate change. So we are questioning how this link between the knowledge and the policy can be trust and better strengthened.
Mike, what would be your response? Like, one of the participants said, the Arctic, the world is a complex animal, a complex building, you know, and a very clear message from the emerging leader. I think also a very clear message from the Norwegian foreign minister, you know. So, and you work as a scientist very much with policymakers. You yourself are a very influential Arctic scientist and policymaker. So what would be your response to that complex dilemma in a way?
Yeah, well, some of it is the way in which our languages, a policymaker's language, the narrative of a diplomat is far different than the narrative and the language of a researcher. And so some of this is you need translators. And I think that's where conferences like this and people like us really work at that nexus between getting data, supporting the gathering of data, and then relying on the scientific community to analyze that data, giving it to policymakers, explaining that to policymakers sometimes. But if this then that scenarios play out and that the policymakers have informed policy, I don't know how you can have informed policy without good research, good data. So that's the first one, having these translators, the diplomats, the policymakers with the research community. And there are people out in the Arctic working on these things, but we're going to need this faster, better, and in a streamlined effect. The second part of this is, we heard a lot today about security, whether it's hard security, social security, community security, food security. I've been talking a lot about research security, and yes, about IP and making sure we have hardened systems and having the right research assets, but the allocation of money to fuel the research endeavor so that you can understand better what's happening in an environment that's changing so fast, the Arctic and other places like the Arctic, so that when a diplomat or a policymaker comes to you and says, what do you think? You have the data ready, digested, analyzed so that they can make good decisions. But unless you have it funded, and cooperation throughout the North plays a role in the funding and in the securing of the data, you're not going to have good data from which you make good analysis.
You talked about language, the narrative of a diplomat. Here we have a diplomat. Stephane, you work for the Canadian government. You work very closely as a government with the scientific community in Canada to inform your policy. Is there something lacking? You see, as a diplomat, there could be not better research, but better communication of research results to better inform you as a policymaker?
I think governments are trying to do their best. I'm not sure they always realize how much the challenge is big. Mm-hmm. What we try to do is to reconcile humankind with the planet. Since the beginning of industrialization, the material basis of our civilization has been oil, gas, and coal. And these oil, gas, and coals, when we start to be concerned about climate change at the beginning of the 1990s, humanity, about 86% of our source of energy to travel, to heat, to do everything was oil, gas, and coal, organic source. And today it's still more than 80%, despite all the efforts we have made. And in order to find the transition to another source of energy, because without energy we cannot survive, then you need to switch from organic to mineral, and to have all these rare earth and critical minerals out of the land or the sea in the most sustainable way you may find, and to give the ability to have other source of energy with wind, with solar, and so on, with hydrogen. And a lot of it is in the Arctic. Now we go back to the Arctic. The Arctic has 22% of the petroleum reserve of the world, but also a lot of the resources that will help us to get out of oil, gas, and coal. So I understand Hugo's concern, but one day we'll need to find the way to have sustainable mining. Otherwise, there's no solution. And this sustainable mining will be a lot in very fragile ecosystems as the one we have in the Arctic. Canada has a tremendous responsibility because half of the mining activity of the world is in the Toronto Stock Exchange. We are maybe the most mining nation of the world. And the International Energy Agency has asked Canada to find a way to make it more sustainable everywhere, including in this very fragile ecosystem, the Arctic.
It's a very interesting point, because it brings me to another issue that I think was an important one, which the Minister of Foreign Affairs raised, transition as being the strategic idea to move from one thing to another, and we talk a lot about transition here in the Arctic, are we moving? For some people, we're moving too slowly in transiting from A to B. For some, said it's more complex. So what is the real dilemma with transition and with moving from fossil fuels to renewable? Like as a young emerging leader, as somebody who is interested in policy, as someone who's working in policy, someone closely policy and science making, can we move faster in today's complex world even,
I think the term of transition is can be misleading, because if we look at how we've been consuming energy over the past 2 centuries, for instance, we see that it's not a transition. We are always adding a new energy on top of each other. So the risk now is to keep the same consumption of fossil fuel and to add a new consumption of minerals, renewable energy. So the term transition is a bit misleading, and I think we are really lacking the term efficiency and shifting our way of life. I think we might need to accept that we cannot continue in this progress-based direction, but accept that we might need to become more, in French we say, sober. I think it's also an English word. So consume less, because otherwise the transition will just be an addition.
But this seems to be a dilemma in the Arctic, because economic development is very important for parts of the Arctic, all over the Arctic. And economic development still today happens very much with fossil fuels. And Mike, you know more about the Alaskan situation, obviously. So transition, efficiency, dilemma. How does the Arctic fit that picture?
Yes, all of all of those, which is why we all work in it, to try to solve the challenges. Lack of infrastructure, lack of investments. Many places in my state look just like northern Canada, look a lot like Greenland. That North American Arctic, if I dropped you in Greenland, you might think you're in northern Canada or Alaska. It's lack of infrastructure, lack of investment, oil rules in most of my state. We're sitting on a lot of natural gas, but we can't get to it. You can get to it, but you can't get to it. I mean, there are no roads. You can't bring it to market. You can't even serve citizens. So there is this dilemma in the larger cities, of course, but in small rural indigenous communities where they're still burning oil. They're still burning oil, but they don't have roads, and that's shipped in once a year by barge because there's no infrastructure, there's no pipelines, there's none of those things. So at a very basic level, because that's I think what you're getting at here, is this nesting doll of issues. It might be okay for a nation state, but a state like mine that is resource dependent, it is in the state of Alaska's constitution that the state shall develop its natural resources for the maximum benefit of its citizens. That's what it says in the Constitution. So when you're thinking about a transition, think about the environment in which the transitions, because this is not a transition. These are transitions, and it has to be regionally and appropriate for a lot, socially appropriate. But it'd be really hard for a lot of communities in the state of Alaska, northern Canada, Greenland, to all of a sudden turn solar, because think about the environment. We're just coming out of winter where there is no solar. So I think you need a portfolio of energy solutions. You need the oil for a while, you need natural gas, you need solar, you need hydro, you need all of those things. It is not one solution for all. Different Arctics require different solution sets. That's why I think it's better transitions, balances, thinking about how you strategize for the longer term. But you better have an investment, you better have youth, you better have industry. You need to make an environment where you have a business that can help employ people locally. It's complex for a reason. If it wasn't complex, and as you said, we have built a society over hundreds of years on almost one or two energy sources, and to automatically go away from that would be, you simply cannot do it. And we're thinking globally, think about countries that would aspire to have a standard of living. Well, that standard of living needs energy. What does that look like? We have a lot of the solution sets. How do you scale it, and how do you bring it to communities?
Can I
Did I answer that at all?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right.
I'm thinking about the
All right.
provocative follow-up question here, because so what I've heard now is that we have a certain status quo in the Arctic. You know, it's tricky to move on as fast as some people would think of. You know, but what Ugo clearly said, that, or at least what I heard, is that the responsibility maybe then for the Arctic often does not lie in the Arctic. It lies with southern states, you know, that are very well developed, you know. And they need to do the energy transition that could have a positive long-term effect on Arctic change. And that would bring me to the question, which I think in the global picture was a bit less discussed, like the influence of outsiders in the Arctic. We hear that the Arctic is very much affected by global actions and global decision-making, global changes, but we didn't hear much about how those outside stakeholders, nation states, but maybe other businesses, investors, affect or not affect the Arctic, and how that is would be is perceived. I'm leading a bit towards the governance question, but also the lack of investment issue that Mike said, and also the question that 15 years ago we started from an Arctic with maybe a bit limited focus, global focus, and now we have a very strong geopolitical focus on the Arctic. Is good? Is that good? Is that bad? Is that?
I would say humanity is lucky that the Arctic is managed mostly by 8 countries. Why? Because 8 is a good number to have a coordination and emulation to figure out where are the best practices and to learn from each other. So the Arctic Council is key. These 8 countries, in addition to it, are advanced economy, strong technological capacity, good science, and good institutions for 7 of them, because these 7 countries are well-established democracies. Unfortunately, the 8th one is not. It's another kind of regime. I'm a diplomat, I will not say what kind of regime it is, but it's a complication, especially because this country has 50% of the Arctic under its watch. And this country just attacked its neighbor in a way that we cannot accept. We cannot accept it for Ukraine, for Europe, but for the world, because we need to send the signal that the crime of invasion should not pay off. It should not work. So it's very important to support Ukraine, and this is a big consequence for the Arctic, for the management of the Arctic. And Russia, that was so reluctant to welcome any other countries in the Arctic, now has no other choice than to reluctantly, with a lot of suspicion and mistrust, bring China. That's the situation in which we are. It's very good that the 7 other countries are strengthening their cooperation. We had disputes or different views, and we have solved most of them. Canada and Denmark had a difficulty with an island, we solved it. That's at least a consequence that we may say positive of the situation in which we are with Russia. The other countries and the EU must have a positive contribution, as the EU has on the science, on the ability to come with international agreements, United Nations as well. But we need to make sure that the Arctic Council will work well with the strong cooperation between the 8 countries. For today, it's the 7 countries.
The like-minded states, how it's called.
Yeah.
And that brings me actually to a discussion point raised during the global picture, was it the series of governance clubs that it called. And there was one question by our moderator. Do we have too many clubs, governance clubs in the Arctic? Is the Arctic over-regulated in a way, from an American perspective?
I don't think it's certainly not over-regulated. I think it's governed. I mean, this myth that it's the Wild West of the North, it's just not right. I agree with the stance that the more discussions, the better, and each international, multilateral, bilateral organization is different. They have different goals, they have different rhythms, they have different causes, they have different challenges, they have different timing. I would certainly not take talking off the table. And if an organization is needed, it will last. If it's not needed, it won't last. So I don't know that it's a bad thing. I think it's a recognition of the issues that we're talking about. The social, political, economic, environmental, the security issues. There are a lot of issues in this region. But think about the statement that proactively all of these organizations have not popped up. They've been created to address a particular issue. Do they overlap? Sure. Is there a Venn diagram of effort? Sure. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. I think they were born of a need. If they're not needed, they will fade away.
I think you raised a very important point. I mean, it would be interesting to have an IR scholar here that deals with international organizations. But really, what you said, if an organization is not needed, it won't, exist forever in a way. And if it's needed, and people think it's needed, then they will do the best to do.
It's not
to keep it
over-regulated. We need to be sure that the regulations will be applied. It's good to have a polar code. But if one of the 8 countries don't respect the polar code, or the other countries coming, it's on paper, but it's not implemented.
That will bring me to another point, application. And what I listened to a lot today was the art of Arctic leadership, what you call it. You know, a pragmatic approach to the problems we have, both on a state level, local level, regional level, including communities, including indigenous people. Soft power was raised. Arctic leadership for an emerging leader. How would you, to put it on the spot, how would you define a pragmatic approach to the future of the Arctic?
Maybe I can rephrase a bit, like I would not define leadership in the Arctic. It's by listening to some of the leaders here, I really had this feeling of cognitive dissonance.
Okay.
In one end, they say, okay, we have infrastructure in the Arctic that are threatened by permafrost thawing. We have a change in the regime of precipitation, and we have a change in natural hazard, so which is a security problem. And this is directly related to climate change. And on the other hand, they say we need to continue to exploit resources without challenging the system we're into. So I just have the feeling that once they really see what is going to threaten their livelihood, both for the nation but also for indigenous people, but on the other hand, they do not act with the measure they should act. So it's more like to maybe be a good leader would be to resolve this paradox. I think it's a big challenge, but we have a very huge challenge that we need to face together. So of course it's complex, but we know where to go. And just to highlight, in a lot of discussion we say we need more research. We know what we should do now. UN General Secretary said we need to keep oil and gas in the ground. This is clear. It doesn't need to be translated. So we know where to go, and we know where we shouldn't go.
Okay, I want to follow up with a provocative question here as well. Like you said, an Arctic leader needs to tackle the challenges at home or wherever it is, and for example, keep the fossil fuel in the ground. But he also has an audience that's the Arctic audience, people that want to live here, and development happens along certain aspects, factors. How would you react to that? Said, okay, an Arctic leader, knowing climate change is happening here in the region, but at the same time also have like an audience, voters, citizens that do want to live here and want to stay here, knowing that infrastructure is an issue and energy is an issue, and you can't just change it from today to tomorrow.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. Of course, let's say, if I would give you the definition of sustainability, it would be to address the needs of the present without challenging the needs of the future. So we cannot keep, stealing from the environment and stealing from our children. So it's a difficult question. And instead of answering by more progress, more infrastructure, we could learn from the people that have been living in the Arctic for thousands of years, and that have a way of life that we could get inspired from this.
All right. And that brings me to a topic that was often raised also in side events today, city-to-city cooperation, regional cooperation, local cooperation, also between Arctic stakeholders, Arctic states. There's a lot of discussion, obviously, about the Arctic Council, other clubs, so state-level cooperation, but we hear more about local cooperation, really trying to bring the city of Fairbanks closer together with the city of Tromsø, or the town of Salla, which is a Finnish town close to the Russian border, closer to Yellowknife, for example. Is that the future a bit, this local-to-local initiatives?
I've been here 24 hours for this conference. I'm fascinated by the amount of discussion about that issue, whether it's city to city or region to region. It's about regionality versus globalization. I guess that's a better way of me struggling with this concept. Is that I've heard more discussions about regionalism, regional integration, regional capacity, regional development, regional integration than I had, and a bit of a pushback on globalization. That's COVID, that's oil, that's Ukraine, that's Gaza, the globalization, supply chains, right? That's not getting a lot of discussion here. Maybe it will in the next few days. But the regionalization, at least in my mind, be interesting from an Alaska mind, Canadian, this North American mind, is that many of us have been talking about east-west for a long time instead of north-south. And so when I'm hearing here, the Nordics, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and others, but but Norway, Sweden, Finland talking a lot about east-west development, corridors, innovation parks, technology innovation, sharing electric grids, sharing of infrastructure, so that you're not duplicating, you're not reinvesting, you're doing it in a much more sustainable way. I think when I think of the North, that's the North I think of. I think of this North that is better integrated. I would love to have more integration between Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, right? But what does that business model look like? What are the policies in place? How do you do that? Well, there are models right here in the Nordics that can show us how to do that. I know that's spurred on by a number of things, investment dollars, it's spurred on by regionality, it's spurred on a number of things, including the discussion about NATO. Moving troops, food, assets from Finland through Sweden to Norway, if you had to do that, that requires something. It requires roads and capacity, but it also can help rethink the way in which we develop in a sustainable way the region. So that's been fascinating me, this regionality, this community-based development and cooperation across borders or cities versus a lot of discussions about globalization. So I think there's two things happening. The realization that the Arctic is globalized now, but the focus for the people in the North is, at least in Mike's impression, is regional capacity.
Very interesting point. What does the Canadian think about that?
We Canada, we are a federation, very decentralized. Of course, we believe in that, but concretely, we'll need massive investments.
Yeah.
We don't have no idea what that means. It is a lot of investment in an ecosystem that will be more fragile than ever. The permafrost is melting, with the consequences on infrastructure. The ice is difficult to predict, with the consequences on transportation. Invasive species are coming, with the consequences on disease. And in this context, we'll need a lot of the knowledge of the people that are there since a long time. And we'll need also to facilitate the ability of the indigenous peoples to communicate between themselves. They don't want borders. They want to travel from Alaska to Canada to Greenland. And we'll need to develop that as well, because without the support of the population that are there is no future for the Arctic.
And that maybe calls for a very distinct definition of Arctic leadership, whatever that could be and is for now. Thank you very much for that quick recap of today's very first big picture. Stephane, thank you very much. Uwe, thank you very much. Mike, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you to have listened for now and rewatch this first recap. There will be more recaps of the big picture sessions at Arctic Frontiers 2024, actions and reactions, global actions and Arctic reactions. Welcome back tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.